Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. We're live again, Doris. At kamusta po mga kausapan? At nandito na naman tayo. Of course, na naman. Parang ayaw na
Oo,
no?
kasama si...
Kasama ko si Doc D.
At si Attorney E dito sa
Usapang Ed.
Ayan, good evening to everyone.
Good evening to everyone.
It's September 1 and we're very happy to see all of you. Of course, the last episode that we had, air up, was August 26. When we had with us Dr. Ed Fermin to talk about Usapang Gen Ed. Oo, naalala ko yung episode na yun, kasi galing tayo sa long holiday.
Yeah.
And then, nag-cancel pa ng work, government offices, August 26. But we proceeded with the episode to talk about general education and how it is articulated with the current, changes in the senior high school curriculum.
Pang-ilan na bang guesting ni Doc Ed yun?
Siguro pangatlo na. Kaya nga lagi naming sinasabi, kapag umabsent si Attorney E at si Doc D, isa lang ang pwedeng ipapalit. Siya lang, mag-isa as himself. Si Doc Ed Fermin.
Hindi si Attorney Joy?
No. Bakit may tumatawa, Era? May tumatawa. Introduce mo na nga. Tumatawa
Tamang-tama kasi. Tonight, ang usapan natin ay usapang complementarity. So, ang ating guest tonight is also a returning guest.
Of course.
Tulad ni
Yes.
Doc Ed Fermin. So, I'll formally introduce our guest. He is the 6th president of Jose Rizal University, a position he has held since 2003. He earned his AB in Economics from Brown University, an MPA and MBA from Columbia University, and a PhD in Business Administration from UP Diliman. Under his leadership, JRU achieved university status, autonomous status, and Level 4 accreditation. Beyond JRU, he actively serves in education organizations. Kasama natin to, Doris. Yes. Of course, sa Cocopeya, sa PERAA, sa PACU, sa PIBED, at sa PAC, of course.
Advisory group ko yan.
Marami pang organizations. And he's an advocate for quality and accessible private education. At syempre, kilala ito as an intellectual heavyweight in education policy, di ba? And an expert in finance and economics. Ako na nagdagdag nung kasi.
Pero pwede ba akong magdagdag? Pwede ako magdagdag? Ang hindi yun ay tatanong, basic ed nito is LaSalle Green Hills, ha?
Aba.
So ito talaga ay private, public, complementarity. Ang nito, background nito.
Dapat ito palang idol ng mga anak ko na sa Green Hills. Anyway, pag-usapan natin ngayong gabi, ang hindi masyadong napag-uusapan pero napaka-importante, complementarity and education. So wala kaming ibang binabanggit kundi ang ating guest for tonight ay si Dr. Vincent Fabella. Doc Vince, welcome.
Hey, thank you very much for having me on the show again. Hello, Doc D, Attorney E.
And you greet all your fans. You greet your fans. Baka hindi nila alam, magaling kumanta to, si Dr. Fabella.
To the fans.
To the fans.
I do. Let me greet other educators out there, educators, students, and faculty. I think we're in the best vocation, advocacy ever in education. Can't think of anything better than it. So all of you who are in that field, congratulations and thank you.
Very positive ang start ni Dr. Fabella. But this episode is about usapang complementarity, and we really want to focus on this, especially because we just started, the 20th Congress, just started, and I think if we really will, find the truth in what you said, best time now to do advocacy work, complementarity is really one of the things we want to advocate. And sana matuloy na tong legislation tungkol sa complementarity.
That's
siguro the Doc Vince, for the benefit of our followers and viewers, siguro can you please explain what complementarity is and why are we pushing for this? Yung para mabilis nating maintindihan.
Sure. So complementarity is, I guess the easy way of talking about it is really, it's a recognition that the Philippine the Philippine educational system is unique, very different from those around the world in that it has both government-run schools and privately run schools. And complementarity is this concept that for the best education to be offered and to be accessible to Filipinos so that they can become the best, right? Make the most of their capabilities. You need both the private and public sector, the governments and the private schools to work together to complement each other for the benefit of obviously the Filipino graduate. That's really what complementarity is about. And it becomes very tricky because if you don't think of it that way, you might think, gusto namin lahat private sector kasi, right? Because that's where all the really good schools are. Or gusto namin lahat public sector government because the schools are all free. And the reality is the best is something in between, a combination of both.
So yun ang sinusulong nitong draft na bill na I think yung kasamang EDCOM 2 dito, no, discussion. You were in that committee on governance and finance, right, that discussed this?
Correct. Thank you for bringing that up. So as you know, there's an education commission, the second educational commission. I'm part of that. There is a committee in that called governance and finance. And within that committee, that's how important complementarity is. It's got its own subcommittee, complementarity. So I head that subcommittee. Last 19th Congress, we were working a lot on the draft bill. We finished it. It passed the commissioners. And I'm very happy we can start it off that way, that Senator Lauren Legarda was kind enough to adopt it, and it's been filed in the 20th Congress already, Senate Bill number 167.
Actually, meron ding version sa House, no? Na i-file. I just learned recently. Pero siguro, just to add to what Doc Vince already said, for the benefit of our listeners, yung complementarity kasi, this is a constitutional principle na nakasulat po yan sa ating saligang batas. Kaya lang talagang iniwan po ng ating mga framers na merong room for legislation. No? So it's not a self-executing principle in as much as it's very important. No, it's very important in our education system. The framers left it to our legislators to pass a law. Kaya lang hanggang ngayon, wala pang naipapasang batas. So ito yung sinusulong nila Doc Vince na batas na sana maipasa ngayong 20th Congress. And siguro, Doc Vince, maybe you can talk about ano ba yung mga features ng provisions na yan, ng bill na magiging batas on complementarity.
Sure. Attorney Joseph, that one thing you mentioned is really important, right? When they were crafting the Constitution, it would have been very common and I think a little more expected na the Constitution will just be about, right, education for all, the best education for all the Filipinos. But the framers actually took the trouble to single out that our educational system is different, that it's got private schools and public schools, private universities and public universities, and they need to work with each other. They need to complement each other for the benefit of the Filipino. I think that's very unique in our Constitution compared to constitutions around the world. Which brings us to the bill, right? So our experience kasi working both with government and the private sector, as both in our university and in the different associations, excuse me, is that without a law explaining what complementarity is all about, people have different interpretations, and that usually leads to a lot of, I would say, conflicting policies. So the most common interpretation without any guidance is to just simply say na government should provide all the education, right? Kung hindi kaya ng gobyerno, right, because of congestion or limited funds or resources, then the private sector can come in. So that's a very limited and very
myopic,
I guess short-sighted, myopic view right? Because if you do it that way, then the private sector will not want to invest in education. Education, like any other investment, has its own risks. They won't want to do innovative learning systems. They won't want to, more recently, they won't want to go into AI or digitalization if they know that after a while, government will just take over. Buti na lang sa Pilipinas, government recognizes this. That's why they put in that complementarity angle. So what the bill tries to do is make people understand how to think about uh, government and private schools working together. And the main, so that's, I think, the number one provision of the bill, which is really a definition. And the definition simply says that public and private schools working together will result in better education for the country than either of them working alone. Because believe it or not, there are people who really believe now all education should be
Should be
public.
government.
Yeah.
And there's also people, but there's also people who believe all education should be private.
Yeah.
And I think the experience of the Philippines is you need to work together, really.
Siguro
so
ang
that's-
ano ko lang, Dr. Fabella, sorry if are you done?
No, not a problem.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so the Constitution has that provision, but the value of this law, if it becomes a law, is that it will define a lot of things. So kasi, kahit nasa Constitution yan, anong nakita natin the last 10 years, for example? Decline in enrollment in private basic education share. So even
Right.
while the Constitution claims complementarity, pababa ng pababa ang enrollment ng private basic
Yeah.
ed. Nakita din natin na naging libre ang SUCs, LUCs, which is again, I think it's contrary to complementarity kasi
Correct.
disadvantaged yung private HEIs who charge tuition and fees. So yun siguro ang kaya tingin ko sobrang lakas ng push in EDCOM 2 and currently kasi nakikita natin na kahit nasa constitution siya,
Yeah.
I mean, in the
Correct.
actual practice of how the education agencies have been implementing their programs, parang hindi siya tunay na na-operationalize.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the important thing about the bill. People don't know how to think about it. One of the big things about the bill, I think that baka more people will it will make sense to more people. Kasi what do you mean by this? Na they have to work together. So one way to think about it, really, I think a very important way to think about it, and a way many of the legislators who support the bill think about it, is really the concept of choice. Because everyone understands
Yes.
quality, right? So they say, we want our kids to go to a good school. If you're a student, you want to go to a good school. But really, what it's about is, in the idea of a good school changes per student. Because it's not just that the school has good teachers, it's that the school has the degrees that, if you're in college, that you're interested in, the school is close enough to you, right? The school might be advocating something you feel strongly about, like environmentalism. All of those mean that for every student, the best school is out there, but it's a different school for each student, which means that if the government's doing it all by itself, they won't be able to give that range of options to all the students. If the private sector is doing it by itself, believe it or not, it also won't be able to give that range of choice. So the best way is really where government gives some choices and the private sector gives some choices, private schools. Yeah, that's one big part of the bill, really. And we actually have it in the title of the bill is student choice. We want, right, in education literature, it's called student agency, but we want students to be able, and parents, right, families, to be able to have the choice of the school they want to go to. Yan yung pinaka-importante. I think that's something complementarity. We've gone through a lot of research on this. It's one of the things complementarity does very well.
So, ang ibig sabihin, Doc D, ay kapag na-implement ng maayos ang complementarity in terms of funding of education, yung estudyante, meron siyang, makakapili siya ng yung totoong pagpili. Kasi ngayon, Doc Vince, iba, parang it's really hard to choose between what's free and what you
Yeah.
really want, no, na as a school for your child, no. So doon ka na lang palagi sa libre. Kasi libre eh. No? So
Yeah.
with complementarity, magiging sila, indifferent sila sa cost kasi sagot ng gobyerno yon at yung mga pipili sila ng quality schools regardless of type, whether public or private.
Yeah. So you bring up a second part that's very important in students and parents making the right decision, no? Itong concept ng cost. Kasi one of the problems is if the cost between a public school and a private school is very big, one is free and the other one's expensive, then there's really no freedom of choice
Yeah.
sa estudyante o sa pamilya. Kasi syempre, they can't afford the expensive one and they'll have no choice but to go to the free one. And what we argue in complementarity, that shouldn't be the case. The role of the government is to make sure that the students or the families have the choice. And so the government supports by making the choice. Yung sinabi ni Attorney E na they're only deciding based on quality and not on the cost. That's really at the crux of the matter. And you have things like complementarity. We call them complementarity tools. A voucher is an example. Subsidies is another
Student loan.
example. Student loans is another example. So in other words, well, two things are happening there, right? So number one, the government shouldn't care if the student goes to a public school or private school.
True.
They should care that when the student graduates, that student is a great citizen of the Philippines, right? And their job is to make sure their taxes, the public money, goes to the school that prepares the student the best. Because that's the best benefit. But what the government wants to do is make the Philippines a great country. So that's the best way to make the Philippines a great country, right? To have the most educated and involved citizens.
Agree.
So you look for the best school to do that, and you don't care whether it's public or private. So what that means is if the government, let's say, I think the current estimate, let's say, is about maybe, let's round it off to 30,000 pesos for basic education for in the budget of the government, right? For Metro Manila per student. What the government does now is they say, I have 30,000 pesos per student. I'll put it in a public school, and the student, if it wants to get that 30,000 pesos worth of education, it has to go to my public school. What complementarity says is the government will say, I have 30,000 pesos. I will tell the student, pumili ka ng eskwela, right? The one that you think is best for you. And whatever school that is, I'll give you the 30,000 as long as you get into that school. So that's the idea of choice, right?
Right.
So the government doesn't care, you mentioned La Salle in the beginning. So the government doesn't care if you go to La Salle, Ateneo, Oveda, any of those big time, right, private, very private exclusive schools, for example, in Metro Manila. Or they go to Philippine Science High School to talk about good schools. Or they go to Manila Science High School. The government shouldn't care where the student goes to, but as long as it goes to a good school. Right?
Okay, so I have several reactions to what Dr. Fabella said, but of course, 100% in agreement, but several things. So for example, we know right now that there are subsidy programs, right, in basic education, ESC, the vouchers, and these are working reasonably well that came out from ADB, and that the three principles that are really, really in effect, underlie this is accessible quality education. You mentioned that. Complementarity second, and efficiency. Yun na nga 30,000 peso cost of provision. So saan siya more efficiently na magagamit, no? But having said that, I think right now the discussion really in all of the subsidy programs is that it is also sometimes utilized to solve some other problems such as congestion. In effect, what is happening is they actually want a prioritization for those areas where DepEd is congested, but without the cost of the subsidy attractive enough for students in public to move to private. Because 30,000 is such a huge amount compared to the current amounts of ESC and the voucher program. So I think mateterno ito dun sa initiatives natin na K-12 voucher, which will be socialized depending on the income level of the family. Then that is where complementarity comes in. Na talagang choice siya. Kung low income ka, mas malaki ang subsidiya mo. Kung middle income ka, mas maliit ang subsidiya sa'yo, but still, government support. Because again, government will want efficiency, no, and the best quality education that it can, give its citizenry. So that's one. No? So I think there's really a lot of things that will have to be thought through in the voucher system itself right now, ESC and the
Yeah.
voucher program, or even what is already proposed, no, in the House, and I suppose soon in the Senate, no. Pero siguro ang isang malaking concern natin dito, and I think it's in your bill, is that our education agencies are not just regulators, but they also operate schools. 'Di ba?
Yeah.
So that I think is the one that I think is also rather contentious insofar as making sure that government does not favor any, because provision is really the responsibility of government, and that you have two drivers, public or private. So can you comment on
Right.
that governance aspect?
Sure. Let me just let me try to give it some. Let me comment on that. Let me comment on, you mentioned yung vouchers na right na baka socialized. I think that's a very powerful and very smart idea, which we're trying to push also. Right. So let me comment. Let me comment on those two. Right. Let me do the vouchers first. So one of the things we've found out really is education is one of the most important things that a family will spend on, right? But what we've also found out is because they're willing to spend on it, if they're willing to spend on it, then you want to make sure, but they can't afford, let's say, some schools. So you want to make sure there's just, if the government gives support and a subsidy, they give enough so that the student has the choice to, or family has the choice to pick from many schools. But they don't give so much na the choice is, they don't give so much that other students are affected. So let me explain it a little better. So let's say the government has 1,000 pesos, right? It can give it out. It can give a full scholarship, right, for one student, or it can give partial scholarships for right, 5, 6, 7, 10 students, right? So the trick there really in economics is just to give enough of a scholarship so that the student is happy enough to get the support, right? But it's enough to make the student affect their decision. What that means is it suddenly, you give enough so that the student feels that the more expensive schools are suddenly affordable, may kaya na. And this is backed up really by a number of studies about how partial scholarships are much better at helping a lot of students, a bigger part of the population, from benefiting from student choice. And I think that's the first item I really wanted to push in the ones you mentioned, right? The second item is where I lost my train of thought. What was this? What is the point you raised?
Governance. About governance,
Governance.
yeah.
Right, right. So the second point there, and you had mentioned it's about governance, right? And you had mentioned congestions and all. So one of the second points there really, which the bill has, is it understands kasi when the public and private sector are both trying to attract the same student, right? That there's competition involved, and once you get into a system where there's competition, you recognize competition, but you also make sure that the system is fair to all the people who are competing with each other. This means all the schools, public and private schools. They like to say that competition brings out the best in the schools, which it does, but that's only if it's a level or fair playing field, right? So to make it a fair playing field, EDCOM has actually commissioned a bunch of researchers. One of them is, there's a series of researches being done by Dr. Michael Alba, which focuses on regulation, which is really how to guide a competitive system. And one of the main things coming out of that research, it's part of the Angara scholarships. One of the things coming out of that research is that the regulator
Cannot
has
be.
to be, cannot also be a competitor, right? So one of the problems in our system is DepEd, CHED, TESDA, they all regulate private and public schools, but
They
they are
actually
also
own.
providing their own public school. So that's a conflict of interest because you'll want your obviously to regulate, you'll want it to be fair to everyone, but you're also operating a school, so you're competing with the others. So one of the big things the bill talks about is that the regulator has to be independent and different
Ang
from
isang, yeah, I'd like to add to that. No? In other words, yung sinasabi ni Doc Vince ay dapat i-adapt din yung principle of competitive neutrality in the education sector. Kasi meron na tayong Philippine Competition Act. No? And then that's one of the principles there. Ang ibig
Yeah.
sabihin, government should not dominate a particular sector and killing competition. No? In other words, by funding one player there to
Yeah.
dominate that field. So if you apply that in the education sector, dapat hindi government ang nagdo-dominate ng sector by just funding government educational institutions to the detriment of the private education sector and in effect killing competition.
Tama yan. I think I'll just add a caveat there, attorney. Education's a little different, right? Because
Of course.
uh, I guess it's not like fashion or selling clothes or
Yeah.
selling cars, right? It's a very different industry. It's also got a constitutional protection too, right? There's I think free basic ed, di ba?
Correct.
Or right. So there's part of it that's seen as a public good, as a right that the government really has
Yeah.
to give.
Yeah.
But you're totally correct. Given that provision, right? You're totally correct. The government has to balance out the field so that it's both meeting its constitutional obligation, but it's also providing a very fertile and vibrant community of competitors where they're all trying to be the best, right? Without any cutthroat competition, a lot of innovation, a lot of reaching out to recognize that by giving a variety of different educational experiences, schools can serve as many Filipinos as possible. All of that needs a good regulator,
Right.
right?
In other
Talagang
words,
kailangan yung regulation, pero
yeah.
that has to be independent, and that's yung sinasabi mong competitive neutrality, right? That the regulator is indifferent, doesn't care whether it's a public or private school, basta it's meeting its regulatory rules.
Right. And it's more of competition in terms of quality, not competition in
Yeah.
terms of share in government resources. Kasi pag
Yeah,
sabi natin
correct.
regulation, it should be regulation in terms of quality assurance. No? So, ibig
Yeah.
sabihin, whether you're public or private, you should meet the quality standards and that competition should be really in quality. And di ba, government
Yeah,
takes care of problems on resources.
I'll do one more addition to that. Usually they ask, so how do you regulate? How do you make sure it's fair and choose?
Yeah.
Right. So the bill has a big section on that. It's called cost effectiveness, which is a very accepted economic concept, and that just means like you agree on certain levels of quality, right? The regulator does that. And then once you've fixed those levels of quality, at umiiba yan, right? There are cheaper schools, more expensive schools, specialized schools. They all have different levels of quality. But once that's fixed, the government should be directing its public funds to the one who provides that quality the cheapest way, the most cost-effective way,
Cost-effective.
if you will. So it doesn't. That's very important. Right? It doesn't mean it's the cheapest school all the time, right? Because the cheapest school will really be just a crummy school. It has to be. You have to first figure out what's the level of quality you want. That might be a PISA level. That might be an international standard. That might be a science high school level. That might be a more basic level, depending on where the school or university is in the Philippines. Then once you have those, you if you're going to allocate public funds, you allocate it to the one which delivers it
Yeah.
the best. That's the cost efficiency. That's that's what the regulator should be looking at.
Pero siguro ang ano mo dyan, no, Dr. Fabella, one of the things that, talagang kailangan natin ditong hurdle, yung idea na bakit sila sinusuportahan, private sila. Parang
Correct.
it's very difficult to sell the idea that education is a public good. Right? Parang wala sila sa ganung klaseng paradigm. Ang siguro marami, no, minsan, no, in hearings, no, in the House and the Senate, we hear this.
Yeah, that's true. But let me ask you a question. I'll flip it around, right? So that's probably the thinking from I'd like to think that that's how maybe a congressman or maybe a secretary might think if they're thinking about it from an audit and
Correct. Audit.
government, yeah, from an audit or government provider perspective. But if you flip it around, right, government is there to serve the citizens, the Filipino. So you put it from the voice of a Filipino, and if you tell the voice of a Filipino, I'll give you two choices, right? You can go to my public school, and you'll have, right, or I'll give you 30,000 pesos, and you can pick a school. I will bet almost every Filipino
They'll
will
choose
say, I'll pick the
the
30,000.
30,000.
Right? And that's the concept of, that's why when they say, but public or private yan, I'll say, you're not asking the right question.
Yes.
The right
Yes.
question is, go to the mother or father and ask, where do you want your child to go and why?
Yeah. Actually,
Yeah.
Dr. Fabella, yan ang sinasagot din namin. No? We say, it's really not helping the school.
Yeah,
See, the
there's
provision
nothing-
goes to the student, the learner, the Filipino children.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. You know, we talk about, so EDCOM 2, its first report, which is probably the most read of its, the more widely read of its two reports, right? Which came up with the education crisis, etc. Talks about a public school system and also a bit of a private school system, right? Which is failing the child in this case, right? Reading scores, math
PISA,
scores,
everything,
etc. Diba? So the question shouldn't be how can we fix that. The question should partially be how should we fix that system, but the orientation that we have to put all our money into that system, for me is kind of crazy, right? You already have a report that says the system's not working, and then what the report is also showing, right, that PISA scores, international standard testing, the scores for Philippine private schools
Higher.
which have participated in PISA are much higher, both in science, math,
Reading.
in reading, right, are much higher and are at par with Asian counterparts, obviously corrected for economic development. But the reason I'm bringing that up is that's what government should be looking at. They should say, where should we put in our money where the students are getting the best education, best outcomes? Not we have
Yes.
the government shouldn't be saying we have no choice. We can only put it in our public schools. That's
Yeah.
very unfair to I think the Filipino citizen.
Yeah.
In the words of the Supreme Court in terms of jurisprudence, ang sinasabi
Yeah.
dyan is education is imbued with public interest, no? So ibig
Correct.
sabihin, regardless of the provider, it's really for the general welfare of the people if you have an educated citizenry. So anyway, may gusto akong idagdag. Paganda ng discussion sa natin eh. So I think so this is my point, no, from our discussion so far. Merong dalawang bagay kasi na kino-correct yung complementarity bill, no, pag ito ay naging batas, no, by implementing the complementarity framework. Number one is funding, no? Problems on funding of private ed. Yung binanggit kanina ni Doc D on policymakers being averse to funding of private education and private initiatives, that should be corrected, no, for reasons already stated, no. That will correct it. Pero may isa pa, no, pangalawa, which I think Doc Vince was already leading to, which is hindi naman funding but regulation. Kasi ang concept ng regulation, no, in other sectors except for education is government control. That has been the concept, no? At yun ang ini-introduce ng complementarity. Pag binasa mo yung Section 4, Article 14, yung mismong provision sa Constitution, doon nakalagay ang reasonable supervision and regulation. So,
Very good point.
complementarity corrects that. Kasi from ever since, no, ang misconception palagi is full control, meaning control private education just like government controls public education. But the Constitution says because of complementarity, that should be reasonable supervision and regulation. It allows the private schools to deliver education in a unique way, but of course complying with certain standards, but in a way unique, no, than what the government provides. Yung dalawang bagay na yun. And that's been a problem. And hopefully with this bill, it corrects that.
Yeah, can I add to
Yeah,
that?
yes, Doc.
So the term there is, as you said, reasonable regulation, and the word reasonable is critical here, because usually, diba? So we said very broadly, you need to regulate the sector. If you didn't know anything about regulation theory, your gut reaction is to say regulate means I have to make sure everything is working the way I expect it to work as the regulator. And if you're not careful, you'll actually be regulating. So you won't be regulating, you'll be running the business.
Yeah.
Right? You'll tell them how
Control.
many people to hire, you'll tell them what to teach, how much to teach. Diba? You'll tell them how much to charge. So parang there's no difference na. It's already become a government-run institution. Now, the reason that's bad is if you become that prescriptive, then nawala na yung beauty of private sector competition. The innovation, the market movements, the thinking outside the box, the fluid and fast decisions, the agility, dynamism, all of that you typically attribute to market forces. Mawawala yan. So the real good concept of regulation is you regulate just enough so that there are no abuses. But it's a what they call a minimalist version of regulation.
Yeah.
Just
Yes.
enough so that there are no abuses, but
Yeah.
the market forces, not private
Yeah.
sector, the market forces are moving properly. In fact, it's funny now when we talk with state colleges and universities or local colleges and universities, the main thing they ask for is less regulation also.
Also. Yeah. Pero siguro ang very important doon, which is also in the bill, no, and a lot of us have been advocating for this, is really quality assurance. No? The state should be
Yun.
very strong sa QA. Diba? Parang yan na yung
Correct.
pinaka-MNE niya eh. So that
Correct.
to me is already in effect reasonable regulation as long as we're very clear about the framework of quality assurance that government
Correct.
will utilize so that all the private schools will know what it is, no? That government requirements, what the standards are required by government. So isa yun. And yung second na sa tingin ko na problematic tayo in terms of that thing about reasonable regulation. Medyo nagre-react kasi yung private kasi nakikita nila na bakit tayo nire-regulate ng this and that when we don't see these standards being implemented by the public schools.
In their own
Which
schools.
government owns. I think dun medyo may sama ng loob yung private, no? Dun sa ganong klaseng, I think it's seemingly, parang,
And
it's ironic,
yeah,
no? It's ironic that you expect this and that of private.
Yeah, I think Doris, let me drill down on that, even to make the viewers understand how important a difference that is, diba? So what's happening there is that's why yung sinabi, I think, which Attorney E said about the regulator has to be independent and separate. That's exactly if they're not independent and separate, that's exactly the problem you have, right? They're seen as providing one set of rules for the schools they own, so to speak, the government, and another set of rules for the private. But let's switch it again to the parent and student's point of view. Would you rather go to a school with a higher set of standards or a lower set of standards? And the answer, of course, is you'll want to go to a school with a higher set of standards. So if the government provides like 85 to 90% of all the basic education in the country, as a parent, you will probably argue what you're providing should follow the rules of the private schools, because we want our kids to go to a school with a higher standard. Diba? So it's actually going the wrong way. What you're describing, which is actually what's happening now, it's going the wrong way. It's where the public schools, maybe because they have to provide free education, are at a different level, different standard compared to the private
Can I
school.
follow up lang, Erap?
Sige,
Question
sige,
ko lang
sige.
talaga,
Oo.
if independent yung regulator and hindi siya owner, no? Meaning, it will not be the provider. So how do we think this through? Is DepEd the regulator? And then who will operate the government
Yeah.
schools? Or if DepEd operates the government schools, then sa provider, sino naman ang regulator?
Yeah, the studies we've done is that the regulator should really be independent. ERB is kind of an example there for energy, right? But the proposal we have is what we call the partnership board, and this actually was the idea of one of the commissioners, Congressman Asidre. A partnership board, it's primarily run by the it's primarily, the partnership board's the Complementarity Policy Board, and it would recommend, so these are the agencies, right? DepEd, CHED, TESDA, ECCD. They would recommend a regulatory structure that is separate and independent. We've done some research. The cost of putting up a independent regulatory agency, as far
Bigat
as
yan.
the government's concerned, is not so big. It might be, I think the biggest estimate we have is just over 1 billion pesos, which is a lot of money. That would rival the biggest regulatory agencies in the Philippines. That is very small compared to, obviously, a lot of the other items which are being in the news now. So I think it's very doable. It's really a question of how much the current education agencies want to spend the time designing that agency.
I'll just add to what Doris said, no? Yung parang like what you said, Doc Vince, about conflict of interest, yung sama ng loob. In general, what we're saying is yung private schools, meron kang binibigyan sila ng regulations, napakahirap sundin, pero hindi naman pinapatupad, no, sa counterpart na public schools. At ang masakit doon actually is wala ngang incentives na binibigay, walang masyadong support. Ang tawag ni Father Joel dyan, of course, is unfunded mandates. We are being given many mandates to follow, pero walang support. Actually, pag binasa nyo rin yung CONCOM Constitutional Commission Journal, sabi ng ating framers, dinescribe nila what reasonable supervision and regulation sabi nila, it is in the supportive sense. No? Ibig sabihin, you set the standards high, but you also issue counterpart policies that allowed the schools to be able to reach that level. Hindi pwedeng hinihigpitan mo on one hand pero hindi ka nagbibigay ng support. I think doon yung sinasabing sama ng loob. Pero alam mo ito pa, conflict of interest, I'll give you a very specific example of conflict of interest. Ito sinasabi lang ng mga schools na participating sa GASPE, for example. Alam mo, in some regions, sabi nila, diretso sa akin. Siyempre, hindi natin papangalanan. Baka mayari sila. Sabi nila, may mga schools, may mga public schools, principals na hindi talagang hinaharang yung paglipat ng mga estudyante papuntang ESC.
Yes.
Why?
It
Because
affects
it's
their
conflict.
budgets.
Because it will affect their budget. May ganon. So, there's really conflict.
Mali yun.
At yun ang kailangan ma-correct yun. And I think that's very ideal. A completely separate agency. Pero sa akin, Doc Vince and Doc D, kung tumatagal yon because of cost and coming up with a new government agency is something that's not prioritized or preferred at this point. Alam mo yung appreciation lang, maipasa yung batas na yan, yung appreciation na how it works, internally magkaroon ng policies to ensure that conflict doesn't really happen. Malaking bagay nun. And then eventually
I agree.
Diba?
Can I react to that? Dr. Fabella and Attorney E? DepEd already released DO6 in 2024. This is a framework of public-private complementarity. And yet, up to now, you go to a conference of private schools and you ask them, pinapayagan ba kayong pumunta sa mga public junior high para i-promote ang senior high schools ninyo? Ang sagot nila, hindi po. So I said, why is that the case? The voucher program is a DepEd program. Can you tell the principal that? Why is it that you are not allowing us to promote a program of DepEd? Because the voucher program is a DepEd program. And of course, they tell us, even in EDCOM, kasi kailangan namin ang mga estudyante para sa aming MOOE. Which I think the DepEd is also looking at now, I think under Secretary Angara, kasi kailangan yung fixed cost na magpapatakbo sa isang eskwelahan ay ifa-finance na ng DepEd at hindi kailangan maging multiplier mo yung number of students mo. Kasi
Yeah.
that's what the principals are saying, I actually spoke, to a principal and told her, kayo po ba ay anti-private? Sabi niya, hindi po. Bakit po ayaw ninyong mapuntang estudyante sa amin? Ma'am, kailangan po namin sila dahil yung MOOE po namin maapektuhan. I said, para saan po ba? Pambayad po namin, ma'am, ng kuryente yan. Pambayad po namin, That's why you also cannot blame the principals. I was saying, nasa ganitong level pala ang pangangailangan.
Yeah, which I think, Doc Vince, before you give your comments, which I think that's why it's not enough. Like, merong DO6, series of 2024. Pero I think it goes beyond that. We need more education champions. Kailangan talaga nanggagaling from different levels of governance.
Para maisulat.
From,
Paano ba
hindi
talaga?
kaya ng isang lang ito, ng Secretary Angara lang. It has to really be cascaded, no? Down to the level of classes, no? And different levels of governance in education. Kasi
Regional
kapag hindi
division,
nangyari yun,
school.
pag hindi naintindihan na mabuti yung bagong framework on complementarity, and we create a new agency, baka maglalagay tayo ng tao doon, hindi rin naintindihan. It will just add to the bureaucracy. Baka ang tendency nun, baka maging overregulated pa. No? So, I think that's why we really need to start with the policy itself and appreciating it and implementing it properly before.
And proper information dissemination.
But ideally, of course, totally separate na yan.
No, I agree with that, right? The creation of an independent agency for other reasons, right? Which is like bloating the government bureaucracy, etc. I think we will have a lot of people against it. But the concept of an independent regulatory body can still work within the DepEd, within the CHED, within you can put enough safeguards even if it's within the education agencies. But that's very important. I think yung sa MOOE, I think that's another big issue nga. And that really shows you again why regulation and the funding of education has to be separate, has to really be separate from providing it. It goes back to the story I gave in the beginning, right? If you had 30,000 pesos, would you rather give it to a DepEd principal and say, ikaw nang bahala sa anak ko? Or would you rather keep it for yourself and say, I just have to spend this on the school I want the most, right? And I could even add my own 5,000 pesos if I wanted to get to an even better school.
Very powerful yung sinabi mo talaga na yun, Dr. Fabella. Parang, if government has 30,000, then would a parent not want na nasa kanya na lang yun? May choice siya, right, where to go. Pero, and that can only happen, and that independent board can only happen if we will have both public and private in it, right?
Yeah.
Kasi right now, di ba, lahat ng ilan ang share ng private, magkano voucher, ilan dapat ang magiging recipients.
Yeah.
It's all government that does the thinking. I mean, no offense, but seriously, we also need the voice of private, diba? In that
Policy
kind of a
making,
board, that will allow us to, operationalize shared governance. Nakasulat naman yan eh. And I think it's
Correct.
the only thing that makes sense, given that you have two drivers, public and private.
And Vince, before you answer, and we've seen that it works in other countries, di ba? Na it can be totally independent and, di ba, honest to goodness education, regulation, assessment. Pero part ng government, di ba? We've seen that. So it's not impossible. So you think that's we can mature to that level? Magkakaroon tayo ng ganyan na.
I think it's very, very possible. It's clearly not a budgetary issue. It's not a conceptually, I mean, in terms of the research, it's certainly not something unique, out of the box, very, very radical.
Too ambitious.
Nothing like that. It's been
implementable.
done. It's really the willingness, I think, of our leaders, our public leaders, to go in that direction. Like Doris mentioned DO6, right? So that's really hats off to DepEd and even under Secretary Angara pushing that, right? See, Secretary Kiko Benitez has said he's interested in doing something similar with TESDA. So it can really be done. It's just a question of whether the bill will help. I really think all of this is to the benefit of the family and their kids who they want the best education for. It can definitely be done.
Right. Oo.
Yeah.
Kasi sa akin, di ba, I had this discussion with Congressman Roman Romulo, no? In fact, nasa batas na ngayon, only quality-assured institutions can receive government subsidy programs. Okay ako dyan. But when you say quality-assured, what does that mean? Does it mean the FAAP schools? Or are we also looking at results of achievement tests, for example, as an indicator of quality? No, kasi they're saying, puro naman inputs kasi yan eh. Yung mga ginagamit ng accrediting bodies, no? Paano naman yung test scores, no?
Yeah.
So sabi ko,
I
pwede
have, I have, yeah. I'm sorry, Doris, to cut you off, but I have a bone to pick with. Sorry. So first of all, I agree with Congressman Romualdez, right? To say the good things. He's really a champion of education, and his passion really comes through in EDCOM. But when you say only quality assured schools, that's the double standard, right? That we're trying to avoid. That if it's private sector, it's a quality assured school, which is good. But he's quiet about the other half in that statement. I'm sure that's not what he meant. But saying the statement the way you said it, you're quiet about the public sector side. And we've actually said in passing, quality assured, yes. Make it apply to both public and private.
yes, that's also
Yeah.
true.
Don't say
Yeah.
right. Don't say na I have 10,000 pesos. Quality assured private. If you fail your quality assurance, I'm giving it to a public school which has no quality assurance.
Yeah. And ako
Diba?
kasi
It's very unfair.
Totoo
right,
yan,
right.
totoo,
And
totoo.
magkaiba kasi yung meaning ng quality assurance sa pag sinabi mo sa public and private. Kasi from the public point of view, being the regulator, actually all schools are quality assured in terms of, di ba, maintaining a certain minimum standard in that sense. Pero sa atin
Yeah.
sa private, it's higher than the criteria set by government. So magkaiba eh. So like what you said, yung hindi nga quality assured quote unquote, ibig sabihin hindi accredited na private school would sometimes be even
So
better than
I think,
a public school, no?
and I think once you make it evident, everyone naman pretty much sides with that argument that it should be quality whether it's public or private.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's just that it's so ingrained. Sometimes it's so ingrained into the thinking of a public official na the quality standards are for all those who are not in the public sector, and if you're in the public sector, it's essentially COA, right, or something like that.
Well, ako naman kasi, ang pananaw ko doon, no? For example, ngayon, merong certification, di ba? Merong accreditation. So lahat yan really redound, right? To assuring the quality of the institutions and our certainty, no? And confidence, no? In the quality of the graduates, no? Parang ayoko naman mag-deal into parang whataboutism. Parang, wag na lang kami kasi wala naman ng DepEd. Alam mo yun? Parang, I mean, we already are showing proof of concept. We're trying to show that, because of this quality assuring that we are very strict with, that is why we have better results. No? So in other words, I think the nudge really is for government to also do QA. Diba? In their own institutions.
That's really how it should be, right? But it's very unfair if DepEd will do its own QA and at the same time regulate.
Yes,
diba? The
that's
private
true,
school.
that's true.
That's why the independence has to
yeah.
be there.
That's
right?
true.
And that's supposed to be the quality assurance of government, yung permitting and recognition system. That should be the case. Kaya lang I
Hindi
think
rin,
merong yung
It's not.
because of the distrust na rin in the system. Eh. Diba, ibig sabihin ngayon, kahit may permit, may recognition, parang like even government schools, parang hindi siya proof na of quality. I think may ganong
kung
rin
aaralin
element.
mo talaga how they do permit and recognition versus how accreditation is done, malayo.
Malayo.
Oo. So yun ang kailangan din ma-improve, 'di ba? Kasi walang rigor, walang periodic, it's an M&E system that will really have to be put in place. And then yun na nga, assessment. Na lagi ko ring sinasabi, kung wala tayong credible assessment, 'di ba, that will already tell us that all of this is translated to actual student learning outcomes improving, 'di ba? Then parang puro lang tayo salita, 'di ba, about a school being quality assured.
In fact, what you said, you mentioned assessment, right? One of the threads that EDCOM 2 was looking at and was pushing is similar to regulation, assessment, right?
Is independent
Assessment.
also.
Should be independent
Correct.
because there's just too much conflict of interest right? Mostly in government schools. I'm sure
Assessment.
there is also in private, but it's more prevalent in government schools now. The assessment has other objectives, di ba? They talk about so-called mass promotion, those kinds of terms.
Doc Vince, when you speak of assessment, so it's student assessment and also the assessment of the system, the education system.
Yeah, mostly, but even the assessment of when it cuts down to it, it's student assessment, right? Because most of the time, naman, when you look at even institutional assessment, that's meeting the institutional's targets, which the biggest target is always student learning outcomes. Di ba? So I was talking about student assessments with mass promotion, right? With the criticism of the so-called mass promotion. But I guess that would reflect to a large extent also in institutional assessment.
But by the way, Doris at Doc Vince, gusto ko lang linawin para sa ating mga viewers din that yung complementarity na pinag-uusapan natin applies across all sectors, basic ed, higher ed, and even tertiary
Oh
ed.
yeah,
no?
yeah. I
Teko.
keep saying schools, no? So
Yeah.
Baka
yes,
lang tayo
correct.
ay na
Siguro sa higher ed
pag-usapan
naman
natin ng
tayo
basic ed,
mag-react
oo.
no sa complementarity kasi dun nga the free tuition in SUCs, LUCs definitely is 'di ba? Parang is in effect what it is adverse to the
Yeah.
principle of complementarity kasi obviously that we're compromised. Private is compromised because of free tuition in SUCs and LUCs. At the same time, there are no student loans, right? Which have been implemented, which could have in effect sana become a tool, right?
Yeah.
For student
Yeah,
choice.
agree. Yeah, the free education in higher education, in college, basically in college, right, undergraduate college, has gotten a lot of both. That's a lot of support and a lot of criticism. A lot of criticism really from economists and several educators who, right, it's targeting the wrong populations. It should be more nuanced to income
Socialized
groups.
again. Back to
Yeah, socialized.
socialized.
Socialized is really a very strong concept, right? The poorer you are, the more money you should be subsidized, and all those things. But I think one of the biggest, criticisms from a more recent study, I think it's a PIDS, Philippine Institute of Development Studies. So there's been a long-term, they've said that there's been a long-term trend of the students going more and more into free education, the public sector schools rather than private sector schools, way before the free education law was passed, right? So it's a really long term. It's like 2 decades or a decade long. What that does tell you, right, is the price differences between private and public, even long time ago, has been so great
Yeah.
that's already affecting choice.
Yes.
And so why will you have free education pa if it's not really affecting their decisions? That's what I'm saying about partial scholarships. You're spending so much money to subsidize education, but it's not affecting the behavior of Filipinos to get education, to get better education. Should have gotten that subsidy, switched it into vouchers, right? Told students will pay for 50% of your schooling, pumili na kayo.
Yeah. I agree, Doc Vince. And actually, nung bill pa lang yung batas, no, in eventually naging RA 10931, that's really the aspiration, at least from the
Yes.
private education
Correct.
advocates katulad natin. That's why it actually became a universal access. So universal education supposedly, and choice is really a big factor, no, for that, no, for making higher education really universal. Kaya lang nawala yun kasi parang sabi mo it didn't change the behavior, no. Those who are in the public sector, they stayed in the public schools, and 'di ba? Hindi naman hindi nagkaroon ng mobility. So in that sense,
Correct.
it failed, no, dun sa universal, that aspiration to make it universal na
Yeah.
wala eh.
So the other thing, I just added, the other thing you talked about quality assurance and all, right? And system, you had mentioned, Doris had mentioned something about system outcomes and inputs versus outcomes for quality assurance. So one of the things with, if you really wanted to test, I think kasi the free education, the way they're testing it is through access. Eh. How many people are enjoying free education? That's an input measure, right? The output
Not a
measure, as we
quality.
like
Yeah.
to talk about, is
Are
actually
they
how many are
graduating
graduating,
and work ready?
and they're not testing that. They're not measuring
Completion
that. They're not
rates.
being vocal about completion rates, graduation rate. That's what we really should be looking at.
Since, ano na, no, 6:40 na.
And then,
Siguro
and I
kailangan
know we
natin ng
promised to excuse
additional.
you.
Oo, sabi namin 45 minutes lang kasi
We will
nahihiya kami kay Dr. Fabella. Pero
It's
ito
okay.
gusto ko lang ito sabihin. At I'll float it. No need to answer. You know, there are some who actually think na baka hindi naman dapat universal access to tertiary ed. I think the universal access is in basic education. That's the one that's rights-based. But for tertiary education, families should also invest, right? There should be some investment because there's a return on investment for a college degree. So I think that's another thing that I know will be discussed thoroughly in the Senate and the House hearings kasi yung complementarity bill encompasses basic ed, post-secondary, which is higher ed and tech voc, right? But do we really need universal access to tertiary education?
Yeah.
You're very correct, and I won't comment on that other than to say, the private returns, what you're talking about, that's very big in higher education.
Yeah.
So you're correct there, and universal does not necessarily mean being free.
Totally
That's
free.
the big
Yeah.
misnomer, right? It just means you have to give them enough support so that they can access it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Definition of terms pala tayo rito.
Yeah.
Okay, Erap.
Napakaganda. Anyway, kulang ang oras
Oo.
natin, I'm
Kailangan
sure.
nating invitein ulit si Dr. Fabella, lalo na pag medyo mainit na. Pag mainit na yung House at Senate hearing. Oo.
Nabitin tayo. parang there's an
I hope it
entire
gets to
episode
that.
for higher education. Kasi higher
Yeah, on
education,
complementarity
on
per se.
complementarity.
Yeah.
But I think siguro just my last point on complementarity and higher education, kung naisip natin na talagang mabigat yung argument for complementarity in basic education, there's really a stronger argument for complementarity in higher education because of the constitutional guarantee of academic freedom. Diba? That's lalo na because of that.
Oo.
So,
Right. Kasi hindi lang funding Ang complementarity, right? Reasonable regulation, respect and appreciation of private, etc. Anyway, I think we will really have to end. I'm sorry. It's 6:40 already and we've been like talking for about an hour and we don't have enough time. We'll just do a part 2.
we lose track of time pagka kwentuhan na talaga with Doc Vince.
No problem. No
But
problem.
thank you so much, Doc Vince. Of course, any last words for our viewers? Baka meron
Showbiz parting words.
parting words.
I guess I started by talking about the people in education. So I'll talk about last words are to a select group in education who are the senators and congressmen, the legislators leading the deliberations. I hope you look at the bill seriously and we're able to move it forward.
Wow.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Fabella.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Fabella. Thank you for joining us. Siguro lang,
Thank you again.
ERA. I think in private ed, COCOPEA, CAP, POPSCO, PAC, ang sabi natin, ito lang ang pumasa. Sobrang laking panalo to for the entire education system.
Ako, I would say, tayo, naging part tayo ng advocacy on many landmark legislations. Some are, of course, unpopular, like the K-12 law. Alam mo, noong araw, bata pa akong abogado noon at ikaw naman din, bata pa noon.
Batang executive
Marami pa tayong
director,
energy at hindi pa tayo rin masyadong maraming ginagawa. Alam mo, natatandaan ko noon when we were pushing for those bills, yung K-12, eventually universal access for the private sector. Talagang ginagawa nating room to room, no? Talagang we go to each senator and Congress who are part of the committees. Talagang we sell the idea to them, we try to argue, convince them, and hopefully magkaroon ulit ng ganong push for this complementary. Because June na ito, the next landmark legislation on education should be this one on complementarity.
Yun.
Diba?
Agree. So with that, we'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight, September 1. I just would like to greet yung mga officers and members of the Notre Dame Educational Association. Nandun ho ako last August 29 kasi sila yung isang organisasyon na nagpilot ng ESC. So napakalaki ng contribution nila sa ganitong usapin ng complementarity. And on September 5, I will be in Baguio City, St. Louis University with CAP Cordillera Administrative Region.
Syempre bumati ka, hindi rin ako pagpapatalo. Pero bago yan, sa ating mga viewers, please don't forget to subscribe to our Usapang Ed, and yung mga episodes na na-miss ninyo, pwede ninyong panoorin sa YouTube, sa Spotify, and of course sa Usapang Ed page. At ako din babate sa mga teachers and administrators headed by Father Jobert Villasis ng Aklan Catholic College. Ako ay nandyan nung August 25, holiday na holiday. Ako ay nasa sa Aklan Catholic College at karoon kami ng very fruitful seminar on school-related violence and bullying. At maraming salamat sa ating mga taga-subaybay. At syempre, yung mga nakapag-register na po sa Raxo Ed na webinar natin sa September 6 at September 13, magkita-kita po tayo. Pasensya na po sa mga hindi na-accommodate dahil puno na po ang registration.
Okay, good.
So again, maraming salamat. Doc D.
Please do not forget to register PhilEd Conference. Extended ang early bird natin until September 5.
hindi tayo matatapos dito.
Tapusin na natin. Okay?
Ayaw mo magpatalo.
Hindi,
Ano pa?
sinasabi ko lang.
Magpaparegister din ako dito.
Correct.
Siya.
Game.
Okay na tayo. Muli po.
Maraming salamat sa inyong lahat.
At muli niyo na naman kaming nakasama.
At sana marami kayong natutunan dito sa ating Usapang
Ed.